When hidden secrets stand in the way of life's path, nothing remains simple. In an old town where friendships and rivalries had long been concealed, there was a relationship that had changed with time. But what was the secret trapped inside a bottle that could alter everything? And who decided to hide it? Miss Marple had only one question. Is this the truth? Or is there something else? Something we never understood? When every road leads to a dead end, every answer is exhausted. Only one thing remains: facing the truth. But is uncovering the truth worth risking your life? It wasn't every day that Miss Marple received an invitation to Hawthorne House. The sprawling estate, with its tall stone walls and ivy-covered gates, stood like a fortress at the very edge of the village, its iron gates rarely opening for anyone, except for the most distinguished guests. Mrs. Clarissa Hawthorne, the widow who presided over the house, was a figure of mystery in the village. She had arrived 15 years earlier, her presence as elegant and enigmatic as the fashionable attire she wore, which seemed far more suited for the grand boulevards of Paris than the quiet country lanes of St. Mary Mead. The villagers were always curious about her past, though no one could quite piece it together. So when an extravagant cream envelope arrived, bearing Mrs. Hawthorne's loopy handwriting, Miss Marple was intrigued. The air surrounding the letter carried the unmistakable scent of violet water, a fragrance that clung to the paper as though it had been infused with it. The invitation announced a garden party, celebrating a special gift from Paris. It was grand, far more than the usual quaint gatherings Miss Marple attended. But as always, her insatiable curiosity won out. She suspected that this was no ordinary gathering. There was something distinctly purposeful about it. The morning of the event dawned clear and bright, the air thick with the aroma of fresh grass and blooming honeysuckle. Miss Marple set out promptly, her sensible hat perched firmly on her head, her sharp eyes scanning the world around her, already anticipating the sort of genteel intrigue that only a village gathering could provide. Upon her arrival, she noticed the garden was already alive with chatter and laughter. Guests wandered from one flowerbed to the next, exchanging polite kisses on cheeks, commenting on one another's hats and frocks. But beneath the surface, Miss Marple could see the subtle cracks in the facade. Mrs. Phelps from the post office stiffened as Major Talbot approached, and young Mrs. Winstanley's smile faltered as Mrs. Hawthorne herself made her entrance, gliding into the crowd with an air of regal grace. Even old Mr. Hardy, who was usually a man of few words, seemed suddenly animated as he whispered urgently to the vicar's wife, who glanced nervously toward the house. It was a web of tension, invisible yet undeniable, woven through the polite small talk and pleasantries. Miss Marple, ever the observer, took her usual seat, close enough to overhear snippets of conversation, but far enough to remain inconspicuous. She had long learned that village affairs were never truly private. Every smile hid a secret, every handshake veiled a grudge, and every inquiry into one's health was laced with curiosity, if not outright malice. But today, the air was thicker than usual, saturated with more than just summer heat. It was thick with secrets, waiting to slip through the cracks. At precisely 3 o'clock, Mrs. Hawthorne raised a delicate silver cake fork, tapping it gently against her champagne flute, to summon the attention of the guests. In her other hand, held aloft like some precious treasure, was a small, intricately cut glass bottle. "A gift," she announced with the dramatic flair of someone who had long been accustomed to admiration. "From my dear niece, straight from Paris. The rarest of perfumes, from a shop so exclusive, they say only royalty can gain entry." The guests murmured their approval, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the flicker of various emotions on their faces: curiosity, envy, and in one instance something far darker. Miss Elf, Mrs. Hawthorne's ever-devoted companion, clasped her hands a little too tightly, her smile strained. Peter Hawthorne, the nephew, who had been lingering awkwardly by the drinks table, looked positively pale. The niece herself, a striking young woman, far too fashionable for her own good, seemed almost entirely indifferent to the expensive gift. But Miss Marple's gaze was drawn to the bottle itself, its glass stopper glinting in the sunlight. In her experience, Perfume was never just perfume. It was a statement, a gift laden with meaning, sometimes a gesture of apology, other times a weapon. The air filled with the fragrance as Mrs. Hawthorne uncorked the bottle, and though it was meant to delight, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something far less pleasant had been set into motion. Tea was served, and the conversation predictably turned to the perfume itself. The guests speculated on its origins, its price, and whether the late Mr. Hawthorne would have favored such a scent. But it was Major Talbot, with his usual bluff humor, who first broke the silence. Yet even his attempt to lighten the mood couldn't dispel the sense of unease that hung in the air. The garden, once filled with laughter, now seemed tinged with something darker, and Miss Marple knew, without a doubt, that the mystery surrounding this perfume was only just beginning to unravel. Miss Marple had never quite been the type to attend grand gatherings, but this invitation, emblazoned with Mrs. Hawthorne's signature flourish, and the unmistakable scent of violet water, was impossible to ignore. The great stone house at the edge of the village, with its towering hedges and guarded gates, was notorious for its exclusivity, and yet for reasons Miss Marple couldn't immediately place, she found herself intrigued. Clarissa Hawthorne, the widow who had arrived in St. Mary's, some 15 years ago, was an enigma. Her fashionable attire seemed far too out of place for the countryside, her past a topic that no one had been able to piece together. The invitation promised a grand garden party to celebrate a gift from Paris, a rare perfume said to be a favorite of royalty. But Miss Marple's instincts were always finely tuned to the tension lurking beneath the surface of village affairs. The morning of the event dawned with the familiar scent of honeysuckle in the air, yet there was something unsettling in the crispness of the sunlight. As she approached the gathering, the usual hum of polite chatter filled the air, punctuated by exaggerated compliments about hats and dresses. But Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, noticed the cracks beneath the surface, the stiffening of Mrs. Phelps at the sight of Major Talbot, the way young Mrs. Winstanley's smile faltered when Mrs. Hawthorne entered, and the sudden animated whispers of old Mr. Hardy with the vicar's wife. It was a peculiar pattern, a quiet undercurrent of unease, and Miss Marple could sense it all too clearly. Settling herself at the edge of the garden, she observed not only the guests' words but their gestures, the subtle shifts in posture, the hurried glances. At precisely 3 o'clock, Mrs. Hawthorne made her grand entrance, holding aloft a small glass bottle that glinted in the sun. The perfume, she declared, was a rare gift from her niece in Paris, and the guests murmured their appreciation. Miss Marple, however, could not shake the feeling that the bottle was more than it appeared, a token of something far darker than mere fragrance. As Mrs. Hawthorne uncorked the bottle, the scent filled the air, an intoxicating aroma that was impossible to ignore. Yet it was the expression of the guests that caught Miss Marple's attention, especially that of Mrs. Hawthorne's ever-devoted companion, Miss Elf, whose smile became almost unnervingly tight, and the peculiar pallor of Peter Hawthorne, the awkward nephew who had lingered at the drinks table. The young woman, Mrs. Hawthorne's niece, seemed to care little for the expensive gift, her indifference almost too perfect. Then, with a small flourish, Mrs. Hawthorne dabbed the perfume behind her ears, her fingers trembling not with age, but with the thrill of being the center of attention. Miss Marple had seen such behavior before. The perfume was no mere gift, it was a statement, a weapon even. But it wasn't until Mrs. Hawthorne's gasp that everything shifted. Her hand flew to her throat, as though a terrible realization had gripped her, and then the crystal glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the stone path with a sound that cut through the garden like a knife. For a moment, all was still. The guests, in shock, stared at Mrs. Hawthorne as she crumpled to the ground, her wide-brimmed hat rolling off as she collapsed into the grass. The silence was deafening before the chaos erupted. Guests rushed to her, fanning her with lace handkerchiefs, crying out for water and the doctor, though it was clear by the time they reached her that no amount of water would do. Miss Marple remained seated, a quiet observer amid the pandemonium. This was no ordinary fainting spell. She knew something far more sinister had just been set into motion, and the scent of the perfume lingered in the air like a promise of more to come. The guest's frantic movements only deepened her certainty. It was the look of fear, the glimmer of guilt, in one pair of eyes that told her everything. The perfume had not only arrived from Paris, it had arrived with a deadly purpose, and Miss Marple was certain that the truth hidden in its fragrance would soon unravel the darkest of village secrets. The perfume bottle sat on the table like a forgotten relic, its stopper now absent, its surface marred by multiple fingerprints, some faint, others more pronounced, traces of those who had been curious, who had lingered too long, as though it were a prize to be passed around. Mrs. Hawthorne, the center of attention just moments before, had played the role of gracious hostess, her smile never once faltering, as she offered the perfume to one guest after another, each taking their turn to inhale the heady scent. Yet, Miss Marple observed keenly, noting the way hands had touched the bottle too often, with an unsettling eagerness. The bottle had passed like a secret, its true purpose cloaked behind politeness, yet the unease that bubbled under the surface was palpable to the trained eye. The conversation that had once been lively now ebbed into murmurs of uncertainty. What had seemed like a harmless indulgence, a luxurious perfume, had swiftly morphed into something sinister, far more dangerous than anyone had realized. It was no longer simply about a fragrance, it was a statement, an unspoken declaration of power, and perhaps a threat. The guests gathered in tight, nervous knots, casting furtive glances at the fallen Mrs. Hawthorne, now motionless on the lawn, her elegant form crumpled among the flowers. Some whispered of heatstroke, others suggested exhaustion had taken its toll. But Miss Marple, whose mind was never swayed by the surface appearance, saw through the veil of polite confusion. Her eyes drifted back to the bottle. The scent lingered, thick with suspicion, a silent accusation hanging in the air. It was only when Constable Barnes arrived, his presence more an inconvenience than a solution, that the unraveling began. A man of modest capabilities, he fumbled with his pencil, taking down names and murmured observations with the air of someone trying to keep pace with a world far beyond his understanding. It was then that Major Talbot, emboldened by more than a few too many glasses of sherry, let slip the word poison, not as a theory, but as an insinuation that carried a chilling weight. The room stilled. The joke was out in the open, but it was no longer funny. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened as she regarded the perfume bottle once more, her mind working furiously behind her composed expression. She could already see the shadows of truth emerging, the deeper currents beneath the surface. Mrs. Hawthorne's death was no accident, of that she was certain, and as she glanced across the room, her gaze caught Miss Eli's, Mrs. Hawthorne's faithful companion, whose grief was too practiced, too controlled. The slight tremor in her hand, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, told a different story. Miss Eli's every move seemed calculated, too quick to steer the conversation away from topics that might stir up inconvenient truths. When someone dared mention the perfume's origins, Miss Eli's knuckles whitened, gripping the table in a tight, controlled hold, as though trying to suppress something far darker. Miss Marple made a mental note, and without needing further proof, she understood the loyal companion, knew more than she was letting on, perhaps far more than she was willing to admit. As the day wore on, the whispers grew louder, less restrained, the polite masks slowly slipping away. Secrets that had been tucked away like precious treasures began to spill out, each more damning than the last. And all the while, the perfume bottle sat there, its scent still hanging in the air, far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined, its secrets now on the verge of being exposed. As the evening crept on, the atmosphere in the room grew thicker, more suffocating with every passing minute. The guests, once so lively and full of polite conversation, now found themselves drawn into a delicate web of whispered gossip and cautious glances. Their voices were low, barely above a murmur, but each word was a calculated move, a tiny piece of a much larger puzzle. Mrs. Hawthorne, the woman they had all known for years, had not been the epitome of grace and propriety she had always claimed to be. Behind her well-manicured smile, and her carefully maintained persona, There were deep and bitter resentments, old feuds that ran like cracks through the foundation of her relationships. The Thompsons, who lived on the neighboring estate, had been embroiled in a long-running dispute over the boundaries of their properties, the sort of petty disagreement that could fester for decades. Then there was the vicar's wife, who had once been promised a generous donation for the church, a sum that had never materialized, causing an undercurrent of ill will. And perhaps the most scandalous of all, the whispers of a long-forgotten affair that had been the subject of village gossip for years. It had never been confirmed, of course, but the rumors clung to her like an invisible cloak. No one dared speak too openly about these things, though. Not with the constable standing watch, keeping a careful eye on every conversation, and certainly not with Miss Marple sitting in the corner, her knitting needles clicking in rhythmic precision, but her ears as sharp as a hawk's. She might have appeared as the quiet, harmless old lady, but in truth, she was listening with a focus that none of the others could even begin to understand. And then there was Peter Hawthorne, Mrs. Hawthorne's nephew, whose presence at the gathering had raised more than a few eyebrows. His arrival had been nothing short of awkward, a strange mix of forced charm and overcompensated politeness that only seemed to deepen the suspicion surrounding him. It wasn't just that he was a relative, though that in itself was enough to raise questions. It was the history between them, the tension that crackled in the air every time their eyes met. Years of failed business ventures had left Peter both resentful and desperate, and his repeated pleas for financial assistance, all of which had been coldly rejected, had surely left a mark on him. When he had arrived at the garden gate, his smile had been too wide, too eager, as though he were trying to cover up some deeper emotion, some unspoken need. His compliments to his aunt had been far too effusive, each word tinged with a layer of insincerity. And now, with Mrs. Hawthorne dead, and the perfume bottle, the last gift she had given him, sitting on the table, Peter's presence began to seem less like a coincidence, and more like a carefully planned move in a game he had been playing for years. Miss Marple, of course, did not jump to conclusions. She knew that greed was a powerful motivator, but it was also the most obvious one, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most obvious answer was rarely the right one. True poisoners, in her experience, did not come wrapped in such an untidy package. Still, she made a note of him in her mind, filing him away with the others. Miss Elith, Mrs. Hawthorne's devoted companion, who had been watching the proceedings with a mix of concern and quiet detachment. Each person had a story, a hidden agenda, and Miss Marple had long since learned to read between the lines. The longer Miss Marple sat in the midst of the guests, the more she observed the subtle cracks in their facades, the laughter that came too easily, the glances that lingered a moment too long, the way some would shift uncomfortably when certain topics were brought up. These were the signs that told a different story. There were debts that had been forgotten, but not forgiven, affairs that were whispered about behind closed doors, rivalries that had festered for years, so old that no one could remember the cause. Mrs. Hawthorne had seemed to collect enemies with the same care. Others might collect rare antiques, each one carefully placed, but all equally fragile, just waiting to break under pressure. Even those who had arrived with smiles and well-pressed gloves were starting to show signs of strain. There were nervous glances, hasty changes of subject, and an increasing need to top off cups of tea whenever the conversation veered into dangerous territory. It was a village truth, old as time itself. No one was truly innocent once the past came knocking at their door. As dusk fell, and the room grew quieter, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily in the background, her mind far away from the rhythm of her stitches. She was sorting through the puzzle pieces in her mind, just as one would arrange teacups on a shelf, methodically, carefully, without missing a single detail. Who had the most to gain? Who had shown the first flicker of fear? Whose story shifted slightly each time it was told? The perfume bottle, that delicate object, was still there on the table, its glass catching the last of the fading sunlight. Miss Marple knew that it was the key to the mystery, but the bottle itself could not speak. No, the truth lay in the hands that had held it, in the lies that had been spun to cover its origins. and in the tangled web of human nature that had shaped every action long before the fateful events of that afternoon. She would let the village talk, as villages always did. They would chatter, speculate, and draw conclusions. But Miss Marple would remain silent, watching, waiting, listening. And as the evening wore on, she would continue to stitch together the threads of truth, one careful stitch at a time. The perfume bottle, now almost forgotten amid the chaotic aftermath of Mrs. Hawthorne's sudden death, still sat there, gleaming in the dimming light. Most eyes were fixed on the body, on the fluttering handkerchiefs, and the murmurs of disbelief that passed between the guests. But Miss Marple's gaze remained unwaveringly on that small exquisite bottle. She reached for it gently, turning it between her fingers with the care of someone handling a precious relic. The craftsmanship was stunning, far too elegant for the simple tastes of village life. And then, almost imperceptibly, her eyes narrowed as she caught sight of a small gold label pressed into the glass. Mi Fleur, Paris. The name was unfamiliar, not the sort of brand one would expect to find in the pages of local magazines or perfume advertisements. No, this was a name steeped in scandal as much as scent, a fragrance house that catered to the rich and the reckless, a place where the line between perfume and forbidden secrets was as thin as the veil of smoke that hung over the city's darker corners. It had been presented as a gift from Mrs. Hawthorne's niece, or so the story went, but Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder, who had truly chosen this particular perfume? What secrets lay hidden in the delicate bottle? As she turned it over in her hands, the questions grew, and Miss Marple's mind worked faster than ever. The game was afoot, and she would uncover the truth, no matter how many layers it took to peel back. The village could talk all it wanted, but Miss Marple knew that the truth was always waiting to be uncovered, and she, more than anyone, knew how to find it. There was something unnervingly deliberate about its presence, this perfume. In Miss Marple's experience, perfume was rarely just perfume. It was often a message, sometimes even a warning, concealed in a bottle of silk, and sealed with the finest of scents. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Hartle, a woman whose memory stretched far beyond her good manners. As they sat over weak tea and dry biscuits, the conversation, as always in these sorts of visits, meandered through the dull rituals of village life, births, marriages, and the occasional tragedy, until quite naturally, it settled on the Hawthornes. "Oh yes," Mrs. Hartle said in a hushed tone, lowering her voice, though the room was empty. "There was talk, you know, years ago, Mr. Hawthorne's business trips to Paris. Well, they weren't all business, if you catch my meaning." Miss Marple nodded, her interest piqued, her eyes soft but calculating. "A woman involved, perhaps?" she asked gently. Mrs. Hartle's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of gossip, her lips curling into an almost imperceptible smile. "A Frenchwoman," she confirmed, her voice dropping even lower. "Some said he was going to run off with her before Clarissa put a stop to it. Never proven, of course. But, well, where there's smoke, dear, there's fire, don't you think?" Miss Marple merely smiled, but in her mind she was already drawing connections. A Frenchwoman, a secret affair, and now a perfume from Paris resting on Mrs. Hawthorne's table. It seemed the past had returned in the most dangerous of forms, dressed not in a veil of secrecy, but in the very scent of danger itself. That evening, when the house had quieted, and the guests had finally drifted home, Miss Marple found herself inexplicably drawn to Mrs. Hawthorne's writing desk. There was always something to be learned from a person's papers, the letters they kept and, more tellingly, the ones they hid. Her fingers brushed against an old brittle letter, its ink faded but still legible. It was written in elegant French, addressed to Mrs. Hawthorne herself, and signed only with the initial C. The letter was no ordinary correspondence. It spoke of an unpaid debt, of forgiveness that had never been asked for, and most significantly, of a betrayal so deep that it could never truly be forgotten. There was no mention of perfume, yet the words themselves carried the same heavy fragrance, an unmistakable scent of old wounds reopened. The past, Miss Marple knew, was never truly dead. It merely waited, biding its time until it was ready to surface once more. As she folded the letter, Miss Marple's mind began to weave the past and present together. Could it be that Mrs. Hawthorne, in her final days, had known exactly what she was applying to her wrist? The perfume was a gift, yes. But the question lingered. Was it meant for her at all? Gifts from family especially carried a weight of unspoken meaning. A niece would choose something floral, perhaps sentimental, a gift that spoke of affection and fondness. But this perfume, its origin and history steeped in something far darker, was not a gift that any niece would normally choose. And then there was the curious matter of the bottle itself. The niece claimed to have bought it, but Miss Marple had seen the hesitation in her voice when the story was told, as though something had been purposefully left out. Could it be that the perfume was intended for someone else entirely? Someone who would understand its significance the moment they smelled it? And if so, had Mrs. Hawthorne's death been a tragic accident, or more chillingly, a mere substitution of victim? That evening, as the village fell into the uneasy silence that follows such a sudden death, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her mind raced, each new thought opening doors to new possibilities. The past, its affairs, its betrayals, its forgotten debts, had crept into the present, like a poison, perfumed and dangerous in equal measure. This wasn't just a village quarrel over inheritance or old grudges. It was something much darker, a secret buried long ago, now dragged back into the light with alarming intent. As Miss Marple sat still in the dimming room, the shadows of the past clinging to every corner, she realized that this was no ordinary mystery. The answers lay buried, beneath layers of politeness, in the things that were said, and the things that were left unsaid. And in her quiet, unassuming way, Miss Marple would unearth those answers, no matter how long it took, or how carefully the truth had been hidden. Her knitting needles continued to click in the silence, but her mind was far away, piecing together the puzzle of a life that had never been as simple as it appeared. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, a soft knock echoed at her door, pulling her from her thoughts. The house had fallen silent, its earlier hum of polite chatter now replaced by the eerie stillness that follows sudden tragedy. Miss Marple rose from her seat, her thoughts already churning, ready for the next piece of the puzzle. Someone had come to her door, and in that visit lay the final thread that would unravel the mystery of Mrs. Hawthorne's death. But who? And why now? Aelith stood in the doorway, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles were as pale as the moonlight spilling across the floor. Her voice trembled when she spoke, fragile as the finest porcelain on the verge of shattering. "I need to tell you something, Miss Marple." The older woman, ever poised, motioned for her to come in, her calm demeanor offering a strange sense of comfort to the nervous girl. Aelith hesitated only for a moment, before she perched uneasily on the edge of a chair, her fingers tugging at the frayed sleeve of her dress, as though pulling at threads of guilt woven deep within. "It's the perfume," she began, her eyes shifting toward the window, rather than meeting Miss Marple's knowing gaze. "I tampered with it." The words hung in the air, weighted with 1,000 unspoken fears, and the seconds stretched on, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock, as Miss Marple's silent patience encouraged the confession. "Not with poison," Aelith added quickly, her breath catching. "I just watered it down, just a few drops for myself. It was so beautiful. I thought no one would notice. But now," her voice faltered, trembling like a leaf in the wind, torn between the guilt of her petty theft and the deeper, darker fear of what her words might imply. Miss Marple said nothing, simply folding her hands neatly in her lap, a gentle yet deliberate invitation for Aelith to continue. The young woman's voice softened further, her confession unfolding like an old frayed letter, as she spoke of a childhood spent yearning for luxuries she could never afford. How the bottles of perfume on department store counters had gleamed like treasures just beyond her reach. "As a girl," Aelith murmured, "I used to save up for a tiny bottle of rosewater just to feel special, like the women in the magazines." Miss Marple, with her quiet understanding, nodded. She knew well the desire to indulge in the things one could never have, the allure of beauty and extravagance that could consume someone who had always lived on the margins of wealth. Aelith's voice grew softer still, as she described her first encounter with the bottle in Mrs. Hawthorne's home. "When I saw it, I couldn't resist. Just a drop, I thought. Just one indulgence. No one would notice." There was no bravado in her confession, no attempt to defend her actions, only a quiet, aching shame, as if she feared her small transgression would now be seen as something far more sinister. Miss Marple listened, her sharp mind already calculating, connecting the dots between this confession and the wider web of secrets surrounding the perfume. Yet, as she took in the girl's words, a thought lingered at the back of her mind. Why had Elith chosen to confess now, at this late hour, with no provocation? People who steal a drop of perfume do not rush to admit it, unless driven by fear, or perhaps by design. Was Elith haunted by genuine guilt, or was someone pushing her to confess, to cover up something much darker? Miss Marple offered no judgment, only a soft reassuring pat on the hand. But even as she comforted Elith, her mind turned inward, considering the larger picture. Elith had confessed, yes, but Miss Marple could sense that something was being hidden, something far more dangerous than a few stolen drops of fragrance. Once Elith had left, Miss Marple sat in silence, her tea forgotten as she pieced together the puzzle of the perfume. It had arrived at Mrs. Hawthorne's home wrapped in silk, given with a carelessness that seemed too perfect, too rehearsed. Who had handled the bottle before it reached Mrs. Hawthorne's dressing table, and who had been so eager to ensure it was opened immediately at the garden party? Elith's confession was just one piece of a much larger story, a story that began long before that delicate bottle arrived on Mrs. Hawthorne's vanity. Miss Marple's mind raced as she retraced the steps of the perfume, wondering who had touched it first, who had truly intended for it to be opened. Elith had confessed to her small tampering, but what of the other hands that had passed it along? Hands far less innocent perhaps than Elith's trembling ones. Miss Marple knew the ways of poisoners, how they often rely on misdirection, on planting small distractions that pull the eye away from the real danger. Elith's guilt had been laid out too neatly, too perfectly timed, and Miss Marple's mind couldn't help but wonder, had the perfume been watered down for a reason, or had something far more lethal been mixed into the delicate bottle? Something that had yet to be uncovered. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was rarely as simple as it seemed. The first confession was rarely the last, and those eager to speak often did so to hide something far worse. As she sat alone, the weight of the unsaid words pressing down on her, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many pieces missing from the puzzle. The morning after Mrs. Hawthorne's untimely death, the atmosphere at Hawthorne House was thick with apprehension, as though the very walls had absorbed the shock of tragedy. Pembroke, the village solicitor, arrived with his signature poise, his briefcase polished, his demeanor stiffened by years of dealing with whispered secrets and family squabbles. The guests, now reluctant intruders in a house gripped by mourning, gathered in the sitting room, stiff and silent, their eyes flickering nervously around the room. The air was charged with a tension that seemed to hum under the surface, waiting for the storm to break. Miss Marple, as ever, settled into her quiet corner, her knitting resting in her lap, but her mind, sharp as ever, was already unpicking the threads of the situation before her. Mr. Pembroke, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding, cleared his throat, the sound echoing louder than any words could. "Shall we begin?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of too many such moments. No one spoke, but the collective breath of the room seemed to hold in unison, bracing for the revelations to come. The first part of the will was mundane, bequests to distant cousins, tokens of charity for causes Mrs. Hawthorne had publicly supported. But the final part, the one everyone was waiting for, caught them off guard with the sharp crack of paper. Mrs. Hawthorne altered her will just 3 days before her death, Mr. Pembroke announced, his voice flat, but the effect of his words was anything but. The room seemed to freeze. The estranged nephew, Peter Hawthorne, had been completely removed from the will, his inheritance erased as though it had never existed. In his place stood Miss Elith, the loyal companion who had served Mrs. Hawthorne for years. She was now the sole beneficiary of the estate. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room, followed by a profound silence that felt like the calm before a storm. For Miss Marple, however, the timing of it all was too perfect, too neatly packaged. A new will, rewritten just days before the death. Such a convenient twist felt more orchestrated than coincidental. If the will was a clue, then the question it raised was impossible to ignore. Who knew about this change before Mrs. Hawthorne had breathed her last? As all eyes in the room inevitably turned towards the niece, the one who had given the perfume, the same perfume that had become the focal point of suspicion, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. It seemed too obvious, too cleanly tied together. The perfume, the altered will, the niece's access to both. It all fell into place so easily that it begged the question, could it have been planted, this perfect trail of clues? Had someone designed the situation with such precision that suspicion would fall exactly where it needed to? Miss Marple's fingers moved methodically, the knitting needles clicking softly, but her mind was far from the wool in her lap. Somewhere in this house, someone had set the stage, shaping the narrative with deliberate care, and Miss Marple, with her quiet demeanor and unassuming smile, was the one who would untangle it all. Every thread of the story, woven so cleverly, would unravel under her watchful eye, for she knew that the most dangerous lies often appeared the most simple, and the most intricate truths were always hidden in plain sight. After the funeral, Hawthorne House seemed to fall under a strange, suffocating stillness, not the solemn peace of mourning, but a brittle, watchful silence that clung to the air, like an old perfume, faint yet persistent, as if the house itself remembered too much, and dared not speak it aloud. The servants moved with softened steps, the chandeliers trembled without wind, and conversations dipped into uncomfortable pauses whenever someone mentioned the late Mrs. Clarissa Hawthorne's name. It was in this charged quiet that Miss Elspeth Marlowe, modest in demeanor, and forever wrapped in yarn and sharp observations, slipped away from the polite murmurings of sympathy, and entered the library, not out of idle curiosity, but out of a quiet, unwavering conviction. Miss Marlowe had always believed that the dead often left behind more than just possessions. They left echoes, unfinished sentences, things unsaid, and secrets that strained beneath floorboards and behind tightly closed drawers. A single phrase during the will's reading, a soft, almost throwaway line about putting all affairs in order last week, had lodged itself in her mind like a burr. People, she knew, did not often organize their lives days before death, unless they were aware something far older, darker, and long buried had begun to stir again. The library was dimly lit, smelling of mahogany, dust and a sorrow too old to grieve. Her fingers, pale and graceful, ghosted over rows of books with a kind of reverent calculation, pausing at a slight bulge in the row where one title stood half an inch too proud. There, behind a faded manual on horticulture, was a bundle wrapped in aging silk ribbon, delicate, forgotten, yet strangely defiant, as if it had waited all these years not to be found, but to be remembered. The letters inside were fragile, their edges curled like dried leaves, their contents written in an elegant but uncertain hand, a hand that trembled with suppressed truth, but still carried the precision of someone used to maintaining appearances. They were addressed to a woman in Paris, the language painfully formal, as if affection had long since been replaced by the need for distance and discretion. What began as cold correspondence slowly bled into confessional territory. A scandalous love, a child born out of wedlock, hastily spirited away to avoid disgrace, and the deep aching guilt of a mother who had watched her child disappear into silence to preserve the family's spotless name. Clarissa's name adorned each letter, her words hinting at betrayal, at a journey taken in secret, and a promise made to someone powerful, perhaps fearful, to never let the truth breathe beyond the pages. But the past, Miss Marlowe knew, has a cruel sense of timing, and Clarissa's recent anxiety, her obsessive rewriting of her will, and the sudden appearance of a perfume bottle from Paris, all hinted that someone who should have remained hidden, had finally come back, not in search of love, but of reckoning. Miss Marlowe stared at the fireplace, where ashes still lingered from the last time it was used, wondering if Clarissa had tried to destroy these very letters, and found herself too haunted to finish the act. Could the child, abandoned, unnamed and raised in shadows, have returned under a false name, blending among the well-dressed mourners at the garden party. Perhaps they had smiled, offered condolences, and watched stone-faced as the family who once discarded them cried performative tears. Miss Marlowe knew better than anyone that revenge did not always come with poison or pistols. It could arrive quietly, wearing silk gloves and a soft smile, leaving no fingerprints behind, only outcomes. Sometimes, it looked like a guest bearing gifts, a single bottle of perfume, placed delicately into the hands of the very woman who'd spent a lifetime fearing its scent. And perhaps with each drop Clarissa wore, her old heart remembered the fear, the shame, the child, and it broke. Now sitting alone in the library, Miss Marlowe folded the letters back with the care one gives a wound rather than a document, the weight of truth anchoring heavily in her lap. The paper might have aged, but the bitterness within remained sharp, unweathered by time. No names were named, no punishments declared, but in between the lines, in the places where the pen hesitated, and the ink pooled darker, lay all the answers. The child had not just been forgotten. They had been erased, and now someone in the house, maybe laughing just outside these very walls, had returned, not with a plea for belonging, but with a long-brewed plan for quiet, calculated justice. Miss Marlowe did not smile, nor did she speak aloud the chilling thought that formed as her fingers closed around the ribboned bundle. The game had begun, and the first move had already been played. They hadn't come to reconcile or forgive. They had come to unsettle what had long been carefully buried beneath layers of polite smiles and half-truths, to resurrect memories dusted with guilt and resentment. And in doing so, they hadn't just stirred the past, they had rethreaded the present, lacing it with shadows that now stretched into every corner of Elderberry Hollow. Miss Elowen March sat by the fire, a single candle flickering beside her like a conspirator listening in, as her fingers brushed the brittle edge of a letter written in a script too neat to trust. She'd seen it before, how death never arrives in isolation, how it is always preceded by whispers, glances, choices made when no one is supposed to be watching. Murder, she believed, was rarely an eruption. It was a long simmering tension disguised as civility, and in this case, she could feel it lingering in the scent of lilacs and poison. She retraced the perfume's trail, not just its elegant journey from a perfumer's shop in Paris, tied with a velvet ribbon, but its silent passage through the hands, eyes and intentions of those who would never admit what they truly felt for Constance Halberg. The bottle had been touched, admired, even envied, before it ever reached her wrist, and in those touches, Miss March suspected, the motive lay concealed like a needle in silk. Vivienne, the niece with her saccharine voice and forced grief, had presented it with too many words that stumbled when pressed for specifics. She claimed to have chosen it after careful thought, yet contradicted herself over when and where she purchased it, and who had packed it into the gift box. Maura, the maid with trembling hands, had insisted she tied the final ribbon, though Miss Agnes, the ever-watchful companion, recounted that it arrived pre-packaged. Then there was Agnes herself, loyal, quiet, and too observant, who admitted almost eagerly that she had once tried a drop for curiosity's sake. A statement too rehearsed, too timed, like a prepared alibi wrapped in a confession. Even Colonel Edridge, whose attention rarely wandered beyond his scotch, had paused to admire the bottle, his voice unusually thoughtful as he commented on the unusual cut of the stopper, as though noticing something he had been told to remark upon. And it was that moment, when Constance applied the perfume in front of everyone, smiling for compliments, glowing under their gazes, that stayed with Miss March the most. Someone in the crowd had nudged her, urged her with a tone both cheerful and insistent. "Don't wait, darling. Try it now." And Constance, caught in the moment, had obeyed, perhaps flattered, perhaps too used to being the center of admiration, but that urgency, that specific timing, it didn't sit right. Why then? Why not later? Why make her apply it before the tea had cooled, before the guests had even settled? The answer, Miss March knew, was chillingly simple, because someone had wanted witnesses. Someone needed that moment to unfold publicly, with eyes and attention, not in secret. And the deeper she dug, the more the timeline began to crumble. One guest remembered seeing the gift unwrapped in the sunroom, another recalled it already opened on the dressing table the night before. The stopper, said the manicurist, had been oddly loose even before it was used. None of these details alone meant guilt, but together they hummed with the precision of a clockwork lie. These weren't accidents, they were careful adjustments, a rehearsed narrative bent just slightly at every turn to make it all fit too well. And when the clues point too directly at one person, as they now pointed at Vivienne, Miss March knew to step back, to look again. This wasn't a murder of passion or haste, it was artifice, it was design, it was a performance scripted to be solved, choreographed with deliberate ease, its breadcrumbs laid out like a children's trail in the woods. The perfume, the will, the family tensions, all too conveniently aligned, too willing to be discovered. Someone had manipulated not just events, but perception. The true murderer had not merely planned a death, they had written a play, cast the roles, set the stage, and watched from the wings as the final scene unfolded. Miss March, with her quiet certainty and needle-sharp insight, now understood the cruel brilliance behind it. The real killer had always stayed a step ahead, hiding not behind lies, but behind truths arranged in the wrong order, truths told too loudly, too easily. And whenever a murder pleads to be solved, whenever it practically begs for attention, the true villain is always the one who seems most invisible, the one who never needed to defend themselves, because they made sure no one ever thought to ask. She hadn't come for the tea or the pleasantries, nor to offer condolences draped in polite smiles. Miss Elira Ventham arrived with the quiet purpose of a shadow slipping beneath a locked door, unnoticed but unrelenting, choosing to remain just beyond the circle of clinking spoons and murmured formalities, her presence blending seamlessly into the patterned wallpaper and perfumed hush of the vicarage drawing room, where every guest, though postured in civility, carried the taut silence of guilt like a second skin. The gathering, on the surface, had all the signs of a genteel return to normalcy. Warm scones arranged with surgical precision, teacups aligned like soldiers on parade, and soft laughter from the vicar's wife that cracked like old paint. But beneath that comforting veneer pulsed something raw, something unspoken, something that prickled at the back of the throat, like the memory of a scream swallowed too soon. The guests were all present, Miss Langley, the devoted companion, with eyes too quick to dart and fingers that trembled only when she thought no one watched, the niece Calla, pale and composed yet coiled tight with some repressed storm, her gaze flicking between faces as if expecting accusation to leap from any one of them. Major Hembry, leaning back with feigned ease, swirling his cherry with a hand that had held far heavier things in decades past, and the solicitor, whose cough returned conveniently whenever the topic veered too close to the will. Elira sat wordlessly, her presence deceptively passive, absorbing the orchestra of micro-expressions, an eyebrow twitch here, a faltered sentence there, the split-second delay before someone responded to an innocuous question about travel or weather. She had always believed that truth didn't arrive with trumpets, it crept in at the edges, disguised as something ordinary, until it was too large to ignore. The perfume had become a ghost in the room, invisible yet suffocating, its name always mentioned sideways, cloaked in careful phrases like that unfortunate incident, or such a tragic reaction. But Elira knew better. She knew that poison was rarely the only weapon in a murder. Sometimes the real blade was memory, wielded with cruel precision. Mrs. Halversham had died not simply because she wore the perfume, but because someone wanted her to wear it publicly, visibly, unmistakably. It wasn't a private act of malice, it was a spectacle, engineered. And the key lay in the will, changed days before her death, stripping Calla of what was rightfully hers, instead enriching Miss Langley, in a twist so abrupt it smelled not of justice but orchestration. Yet Elira had noticed one detail no one else had spoken of. The bottle itself, elegant but altered. Its stopper tampered with in a way only someone familiar with sabotage would know. Major Hembry, the quiet man at the edge of every community event, always helpful, always harmless, had once served in the Intelligence Bureau. His past shrouded in commendations and sealed records. A man trained to hide in plain sight. It was he who had complimented the scent that day, who had handed the bottle to Mrs. Halversham with casual insistence, who had told the maid it reminded him of Paris, in the cold years, a phrase Elira now saw as a breadcrumb, a confession disguised as nostalgia. Her voice finally broke the surface. soft but weighted. As she placed her untouched cup down with deliberate care, the clink, louder than necessary. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said, scanning their faces. "How a gift meant to honor memory was chosen not for its beauty, but its origin. Paris, 1947. A name, a year, a scent." The room tensed. Even the air felt stiller, like it too was holding its breath. The perfume wasn't meant for affection. It was a message, a warning. And it wasn't for Mrs. Halversham. It was for everyone else in this room. A reminder, a threat. Eyes turned slowly, and at last they landed on Major Hembry, who did not speak, who did not blink, but whose lips parted as if he'd been caught mid-thought, mid-lie. Elira leaned back, her tone unchanging, her gaze unflinching. "You wanted her to die in front of witnesses. You wanted it to look like someone else's crime. But you also wanted us to remember who she used to be, and what she did to you. You wanted the last word, Major. And now, I suppose, you have it. Only it isn't quite the word you imagined." In that moment, the room became a theater of silence. No gasps, no denials, only the long exhale of realization as the pieces slid into place. And the man no one had feared revealed himself not through anger or panic, but by the sudden absence of the story he always told. For the first time in years, Major Hembry said nothing. No one remembered Arthur Belgrave anymore, not as he truly was, only as a background figure in wedding photographs and charity rosters, a quiet man whose devotion to Eleanor Pemberton had once burned so brightly it nearly consumed him, only to be snuffed out by her sudden marriage to a shipping magnate nearly twice her age. And yet, he had stayed, like a shadow stretching behind her elegant life, never intruding, always helpful, always kind, until the day a crate arrived from the east, containing rare porcelain and a bottle of perfume said to be crafted from orchids that only bloomed once every 10 years, harvested from the mouth of a dormant volcano in Okinawa. Its arrival was the beginning, though no one saw it that way. At least, not until Eleanor collapsed at the spring fundraiser, her pulse faltering, her breath shallow, the scent of those impossible orchids lingering long after her body had been carried away. The whispers began immediately. Poison, inheritance, the foreign origin of the gift. But it was not until Miss Adrian Harlow, the town's soft-spoken archivist and widow of the late judge, took quiet interest in the inconsistencies that the truth began to unfurl. Adrian, who had once spent years translating wartime letters for the Historical Society, recognized the calligraphy on the gift's tag as belonging to Arthur himself, though he had claimed the perfume had come anonymously. She saw the way his hand shook slightly at Eleanor's funeral, not with grief but with anticipation. She saw the pattern, the letters sent to Eleanor decades earlier returned unopened, the way Arthur had acquired an estate just a week before her death, purchased under the name of a long-dead cousin. This was not a crime born of greed or jealousy, but of a long-decaying love turned to ruin, each year of rejection calcifying into something cruel and meticulous. The plan had been simple: gift Eleanor something beautiful, something rare, and let nature or chemistry do the rest. But Arthur's mistake had not been in the delivery of the poison, it had been in forgetting Adrian Harlow's mind, sharpened by years of watching courtrooms and cataloguing secrets no one else bothered to read. She followed the trail with the patience of a spider, the imported gift slip that was missing its customs seal, the gardener who remembered Arthur visiting the estate's greenhouse late into the night, the pharmacy ledger where he had quietly acquired alkaloids known to mimic cardiac failure. When she confronted him, there was no dramatic confession, only a soft smile, tired and resigned. "I didn't kill her out of hate," he said. "I killed what she turned me into." And then, as the police led him away, Adrian returned to her small stone cottage and placed the perfume bottle, gloved and sealed, onto her mantel beside a collection of other curiosities. The village moved on, as villages do, folding the story into their quiet routines, baking it into their whispers, watering it into their gardens. But Adrian knew something others did not. When she returned the next morning to give her formal statement, the bottle was gone. No theft reported, no evidence misplaced, just gone, as if it had never existed. The constable mumbled something about misfiling, But Adrian had seen the way his eyes lingered too long on her hands, how his wife had once envied Eleanor's charm, and how, just 2 weeks prior, he had received an anonymous parcel of his own. In places like Hollowmere, crimes did not end. They receded, only to bloom again when the season was ripe. The bottle had vanished. Yes, but its story had not. It lived now in the corners of rooms, in the hush after a name is spoken, in the way Adrian sometimes stood too still, listening to nothing, and everything, at once. The case had been declared closed, the guilty named, the puzzle seemingly complete, but in Miss Elira Dawn's mind, the threads never quite stopped unraveling. Beneath the calm surface of confessions and resolutions, something fragile still trembled, like the shimmer of a scent that refuses to fade. No matter how many windows you open, that missing perfume bottle, seemingly insignificant to others, haunted her not because of what it was, but because of what it might have hidden. In a village like Ashmore, nothing ever truly disappears without reason, especially not something delicate enough to carry secrets in its scent. Perhaps it had passed through one more hand than anyone realized. Perhaps it had captured the final breath of a confrontation, or soaked up the quiet agony of an old betrayal. And what if the person who had taken it hadn't done so out of malice, but desperation, shielding someone they loved from a truth too sharp to survive exposure? A mother covering her child's shame, a lover erasing the evidence of a forbidden tryst, or a friend sacrificing their silence to preserve a bond already breaking. But then again, there's a darker path, a second colder possibility, that the bottle was removed not to protect, but to destroy. A quiet act of revenge from someone whose smile had been too polite for too long. Someone who had watched from the edges, letting pain simmer beneath their skin, until it became a motive even they couldn't name aloud. Elira knew such motives well, not born from villainy, but from wounds left too long untreated. And the most dangerous secrets she'd learned weren't shouted in anger. They were whispered through locked doors, buried beneath everyday kindness, left to rot in the stillness between glances. Even now, as she sat alone with her tea cooling beside her and her knitting needles unmoved in her lap, she felt it, that hollow ache of an ending that wasn't real. A conclusion written more for peace than truth. The village had gone on, of course, children laughing in the streets, gossip fluttering like laundry in the breeze, doors opening and closing with the rhythm of routine. But behind it all, Elira sensed the lingering presence of something unspoken. Not all stories end in courtrooms. Some drift into memory, rewritten by silence, shaped by fear, and locked away behind eyes that smile too easily. What disturbed her most wasn't the crime. It was how quickly everyone accepted the first convenient answer, how eager they were to tuck the truth away like a broken ornament no one wished to discuss. Because in the end, it wasn't the perfume that made this case unforgettable. It was what it revealed about the people around it. Their vanities, their regrets, their obsessions. These are the real fragrances that linger. The ones we pretend not to smell. The ones we carry with us long after the scene is cleared. And perhaps the greatest mystery was not who took the perfume, but why its absence still echoed like a question no one wanted to ask. Was it stolen in love, hidden in fear, or taken by a hand that still bore an old grudge masked by time? Now I want to hear from you. What's your theory? Who do you think took the perfume? And what were they really trying to hide or protect? And if you were standing where Elira stood, would you have believed the confession, or kept searching for the truth hidden beneath the silence? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading each one. And if you love mysteries where soft whispers carry the weight of dark truths, be sure to subscribe, because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't solved in front of an audience. They're the ones that linger quietly, like scent on the skin, long after the case is supposedly closed.